The wind howled across the vast fields of Lancaster, biting at the corners of Jacob Stoltzfus's farm as he stood alone beneath the beams of his humble cabin. His neighbors had laughed at his strange decision to place slats on his roof, an odd addition to a house where nothing extra was ever needed. They didn't understand, couldn't see what Jacob knew deep in his bones. Sometimes the simplest things save the most. It wasn't until winter came in full force, shattering everything the townsfolk thought they knew about survival, that they realized Jacob had built not just a home but a shield against the cold. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet perseverance and simple wisdom speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. Jacob Stoltzfus had always been a man of quiet reflection, not given to quick decisions or the rush of community trends. He built his life slowly, stone by stone, beam by beam, just as he had been taught. Yet this was Lancaster, where men lived by efficiency, not excess. So when Jacob decided to add wooden slats across the roof of his cabin, the town erupted with laughter. They gathered in front of his home, muttering under their breath as they watched him work. "Pointless," they said. "You'll never see a return on all that effort." Jacob had heard it all before. The slats weren't necessary, they argued. There was no cold to outlast in this gentle winter. And as for the extra labor, why waste your time? His neighbors built their homes fast and cheap, and it was enough to survive most winters. But Jacob wasn't most men. He had grown up in a family that believed in taking time to prepare for things unseen, the hard seasons no one expected. His father often told him, "The real strength of a home is what it withstands when the storms come." That first winter the storm arrived sooner than expected. It came with wind that snapped trees like twigs, and snow that buried the fields deep. The town's cabins, built with the rush of short winters in mind, shuddered under the weight of the storm. Neighbors huddled around fireplaces, trying to keep warm, but the wind found its way into every crack. The cold seeped through the walls, chilling them to their very bones. Jacob, however, sat in his cabin, the fire crackling but the air still warm. His wooden slats, though mocked, had provided the extra insulation he'd hoped for. The wind couldn't bite through his roof. No cracks in his cabin sent shivers down his spine. His neighbors, at first incredulous, soon began to seek his advice. They stood by his doorstep, no longer laughing, but asking how Jacob's cabin withstood the storm that had made their homes barely bearable. And it was in the silence of that snowbound season that Jacob found what he had always known: the most modest ideas often have the greatest worth. By early December the storm had passed, but the damage was clear. The town was a sea of snow, with deep drifts that seemed to rise higher with each gust of wind. It had been one of the coldest, most brutal winters anyone could remember. The usual warmth of the hearth barely kept the chill at bay, and fires were constantly stoked with dwindling supplies. But as the days passed, the real test for the town's settlers came not from the cold, but from the realization that their homes were not built for such a harsh season. Jacob Stoltzfus's neighbors, once so certain that his slatted roof was foolishness, found themselves making the long walk to his farm. They weren't here for advice, not yet. They were here for refuge. Jacob had anticipated the need for a proper roof, one that could trap heat within and allow moisture to escape. The slats, carefully arranged across his roof, created a natural system of ventilation that allowed warmth to circulate beneath, rather than becoming trapped in the wooden beams where it would freeze. As Jacob opened the door to the first family in need of shelter, he noticed the frost on their brows, the icicles hanging from their coats. The cold had bitten at them, their homes no longer strong enough to shield them from the relentless wind. But inside Jacob's cabin, there was a still warmth that seemed to stretch out, pulling them in. They looked around, noticing the simple yet sturdy design of his home. The slats, though small, had created a difference they could feel. It was in that moment, as Jacob tended to his neighbors, offering them warmth and food, that he realized the true weight of the season. It wasn't just the storm that tested a home, but the way a community weathers it together. And though his neighbors had once scorned his choices, they now understood the quiet strength of Jacob Stoltzfus's faith, not just in the work of his hands, but in the wisdom of preparing for what no one could see. By late January, the snow was still relentless. The prairie stretched wide and empty, broken only by the occasional farmhouse, all of which were battered by the fierce winds. Jacob Stoltzfus's cabin, standing firm and warm, became a place of quiet refuge for the entire valley. Word had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just Jacob's roof slats that had kept his home safe, but the way his entire house seemed to have been built for this exact kind of test. Each wooden beam and stone foundation had been meticulously placed with care and intention. And as the weeks passed, Jacob's farm became a shelter, not just for the weary, but for those who now understood the importance of preparation. It started with one family coming to stay the night, but soon it became routine. A mother and her 3 children knocked on Jacob's door one evening in February, their faces wind-burned and pale from the cold. Jacob welcomed them in without hesitation, offering them blankets, hot tea, and the warmth of a fire. They had walked for miles through the snow, leaving their own cabin behind in search of shelter. Jacob did not ask them how they had ended up in such dire straits. He knew their story already. Most of the homes in the valley were built quickly, without considering the cold that could come at any moment. Many families had not prepared for the harshness of a true winter, and now the very nature of survival was in their hands. Those who had the foresight to take their time had become the lifeline for the rest. The townsfolk, once proud of their quick and cheap shelters, now came by in groups offering help, but also seeking counsel. How had Jacob made his home so warm without the use of a stove? How did he prepare his roof so carefully, ensuring that not a single flake of snow would collect? Jacob shared his knowledge quietly, never boasting, always careful not to make others feel foolish for their own past decisions. In the weeks that followed, the slats on Jacob's roof became more than just a physical feature of his home. They became a symbol of thoughtful preparation, of wisdom gained not through forceful action, but through steady reflection. Jacob had not been in a hurry when he built his cabin. While his neighbors had rushed to finish their homes as quickly as possible, Jacob had known that sometimes the most important things require waiting. He watched the families who had come to his door, all of them strangers in the beginning, but now sharing his hearth and his bread. As the days grew colder, Jacob felt a warmth inside him, not just from the fire, but from the quiet humility of knowing that when the storms come, the smallest preparations can make all the difference. And so he worked alongside the others, reinforcing their homes where he could, offering advice and sharing what he had learned. By March, the wind had softened and the snow began to melt, revealing the thawed earth beneath. It was the season of renewal, of planting and sowing. Yet for Jacob, it felt like the world had already been tested in ways that would change it forever. His home had stood firm through the winter, but now the weight of the cold seemed to be lifting, and with it, a new understanding among his neighbors. The once bustling town of Lancaster, now quieted by the long winter, slowly came back to life as families began rebuilding, their homes no longer just shelters from the elements, but a symbol of the season's struggle. The early arrivals, those who had taken shelter in Jacob's cabin, came by one, ready to offer their thanks. Jacob did not ask for anything in return, but their gratitude was enough. It was the kind of thanks that spoke not in words, but in actions, in the effort to rebuild with the same care and deliberation that Jacob had shown. As Jacob walked across the fields that had been covered in snow for months, he saw a subtle shift in the way the land was being treated. Where once, in the rush to establish a life, people had made do with quick solutions, now there was a sense of deliberate, careful attention to detail. Homes were being rebuilt with double walls, proper insulation, and roofs designed to withstand the forces of nature. What had once seemed excessive, those slats across Jacob's roof, the careful placement of every stone, was now the model. Jacob knew that rebuilding his neighbors' homes would not solve all their problems, but it had given them something far more valuable, the lesson that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the quiet, patient choices made in the face of uncertainty. One afternoon, as he stood in the yard watching the first of the spring crops push their way through the soil, a neighbor, William Crawford, approached him. William, who had mocked Jacob for his foolish roof slats during the winter, now had a look of solemn respect on his face. "I called you a fool," he said quietly, "but now I see the truth in what you did. It wasn't just the slats, Jacob. It was the time, the care. You saw the future before any of us did." Jacob nodded, a simple acknowledgment of the change in the air, the feeling of humility that was now shared between them. William's cabin was nearly finished, and it stood stronger than before, with thick walls, proper insulation, and, yes, wooden slats across the roof. "Sometimes," Jacob said softly, "it's not about knowing what will happen. It's about trusting that preparation, even when it's slow, will carry us through." As spring began to fully bloom, the town's air was filled with more than just the scent of fresh earth and growing crops. It was filled with a deeper respect for the quiet lessons that Jacob had shared through his simple actions. What had once been dismissed as foolishness was now seen for what it truly was, wisdom in disguise. And as the seasons turned, Lancaster would never forget the winter they had survived, and the man who had shown them the strength of simplicity. By the time the warmth of summer had settled over Lancaster, the town had transformed. What was once a place of hurried construction and shortcuts was now a community built on patience and foresight. The winds of the past winter had swept through their homes, but the lessons had taken root deep within the soil, far beyond what anyone had expected. Jacob Stoltzfus, though still humble and quiet in his ways, had become a quiet leader in the community. It was not by force nor by loud proclamations, but by the slow, steady rhythm of his actions that he had led them. The cabin that had stood against the harshest winter now stood as a symbol of something far greater, of the strength that comes from preparation, of the wisdom found in patience, and of the silent power that comes from trusting in one's own quiet knowledge. In the weeks that followed the storm, Jacob had been asked to help with more than just repairs. People began coming to him for advice on their farms, on their homes, and even on their lives. They came seeking the kind of wisdom that only comes from years of thoughtful action, the kind of wisdom Jacob had learned not in books, but through the hard work of a life lived close to the land. Yet Jacob never spoke much of his own beliefs. He would only smile and speak simply, as he always had. "Prepare for what you know is coming, and when it does, you'll find the strength to endure." The words were always humble, but they carried more weight now than they ever had before. As the seasons passed and life slowly returned to a more peaceful rhythm, Jacob felt a deep sense of gratitude for the community around him. He had never wanted praise for his actions, nor did he seek acknowledgement. But as his neighbors rebuilt their homes and their lives, he couldn't help but notice a change in the way they worked. There was care in every nail, deliberation in every beam. The rush was gone. What had once been a race to finish the job was now a slow, steady process of craftsmanship. The lessons of that harsh winter had been absorbed. One day, as Jacob stood by his cabin, watching the fields come alive with new crops, William Crawford, now a close friend and fellow farmer, approached him. William had rebuilt his cabin, just as Jacob had suggested, with double walls, insulation, and slats across the roof. "Jacob," William said, his voice filled with quiet respect, "I've been thinking about the winter, and I realized something. You didn't just show us how to build a house. You showed us how to live, to take time, to think beyond what's easy." Jacob simply nodded. the hint of a smile playing at the edges of his lips. "It's not about knowing what will happen, William. It's about preparing for whatever may come, even when no one else can see it." That was the lesson that had carried them through, not just the storm, but the spirit of endurance and humility that Jacob had embodied all along. And as the seasons shifted and more crops were harvested, the town of Lancaster began to thrive again, not just physically, but spiritually. They had learned to value preparation, not just for the material needs, but for the quiet strength of the spirit, grounded in simplicity. Years passed, and Lancaster, once a small, humble town, grew in both size and strength. The lesson Jacob had taught them in that winter of 1880 had been passed down from generation to generation. The story of the pointless slats on his roof became part of local lore, a tale of quiet wisdom and preparedness in the face of uncertainty. Jacob Stoltzfus had never sought fame, nor had he wanted to be remembered as anything more than a simple man of faith and action. Yet in his heart, he knew that his actions had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after he was gone. His cabin, with its carefully placed slats, had become a symbol of something far beyond shelter. It was a reminder of the quiet power of foresight and the resilience that could be found in the smallest of decisions. Even as time moved on, Jacob never strayed from his simple ways. He continued to care for his farm, tend to his animals, and share his knowledge with anyone who sought it. And in turn, the people of Lancaster continued to build not just homes, but legacies, homes that stood strong in the face of the harshest winters and communities that thrived because they understood the value of preparation. In his later years, Jacob would often sit by his cabin watching the sunsets over the fields, the same sunsets he had watched as a young man. And though the world around him had changed, he remained a quiet witness to the power of the simple life he had chosen. One day, when Jacob was in his 70s, a young man, eager to build his first home, came to him seeking advice. Jacob, though older and slower than he used to be, welcomed the boy into his home with the same warmth and kindness that had always been his way. "How do I build a house like yours?" the young man asked, looking up at the sturdy structure Jacob had built all those years ago. Jacob smiled and gestured to the roof above. "It's not about how you build, my boy. It's about why you build. Build for the future, for what you can't see. The rest will follow." And so, as Jacob passed his knowledge on to another generation, he knew that his legacy would live on, not in the physical walls of his cabin, but in the hearts of the people who carried his lessons forward. The simple slats, once ridiculed, had stood the test of time, not just as a part of a building, but as a testament to the strength of preparation, patience, and humble wisdom. The future, after all, was in the slats, and in the quiet moments that built a life. As Jacob Stoltzfus aged, Lancaster continued to flourish. The once skeptical townsfolk who had ridiculed his pointless roof slats now shared his story with newcomers, often offering his humble home as a model of how to endure the fiercest of storms. His life had become a quiet testament to the strength found in preparation, and his neighbors, though often stubborn in their ways, had come to value his wisdom. By the time Jacob reached his late 60s, Lancaster had grown into a thriving community. Families had rebuilt their homes after the harsh winter, following Jacob's advice and building with care and purpose. The slats on Jacob's roof had become symbolic of more than just survival. They represented foresight and simplicity, traits that were becoming rarer as the world outside Lancaster moved faster and faster. The seasons continued to change. Every year, the snow came a little earlier, the winds a little colder, and yet Jacob's home stood steady against the elements. The town had learned that it wasn't the speed of construction that mattered, but the thoughtfulness behind it. They took their time now, with every home built stronger, every roof more secure. The principles Jacob had instilled, slow, deliberate, and thoughtful action had spread throughout the valley, reaching every corner of Lancaster. 1. Early fall, a particularly fierce storm swept through the region. The winds howled, rattling windows and doors, while snow, heavy and unrelenting, began to fall. People braced themselves for another long winter, their homes fortified with the knowledge that had come from Jacob's example. As the storm intensified, the townsfolk gathered in their homes, but they knew they would be safe. For many, the comfort came not from the fire burning in their hearths, but from the peace of knowing that they had built their homes as Jacob had shown them, to last, to endure, and to offer refuge against the elements. Through it all, Jacob continued his work on the farm. The land, which had been hard and unforgiving in his youth, had now become a source of quiet satisfaction. The crops grew stronger each year, the animals healthier, and the rhythms of life continued on, unhurried and sure. As Jacob tended to his fields one cool autumn morning, he reflected on how far the community had come. The simple act of building a home had evolved into a way of life that brought the people of Lancaster closer together, rooted in the earth and the lessons of the past. Jacob's legacy was more than just the cabin he had built. It was in the land that flourished under his careful attention, the lives of those who had learned from him, and the community that had grown stronger in the face of hardship. The town had learned that the storms would come and that they would survive them, not because they were quick or efficient, but because they had learned the value of patience and thoughtful preparation. The years continued to pass, and Jacob Stoltzfus grew older, the lines on his face deepening with time. But even as the seasons changed and the world around him seemed to rush forward, Jacob remained a steady presence in Lancaster. His days were now marked by the familiar rhythm of farm life, the planting of crops, the care of animals, and the quiet solace of watching the land that had sustained him for so many years. Yet, as the years wore on, Jacob began to notice the subtle shifts in the town. New families arrived, eager to start their own homesteads, and with them came new ways of thinking. Though the town had preserved the lessons of the past, there was a growing urgency in the air. The world beyond Lancaster was moving faster, driven by technology and innovation that seemed to have little place in Jacob's world. But Jacob remained steadfast. He knew that the lessons he had shared with his neighbors, the slow, thoughtful approach to life, were still needed in a world that increasingly valued speed over substance. One afternoon, as Jacob sat in his favorite chair by the window, a young man approached him. His name was Samuel, a recent arrival to Lancaster, eager to build a cabin on a plot of land he had claimed. Samuel had heard the stories about Jacob's cabin, about the roof slats that had withstood the storm, and about the man who had built a home not just for survival, but for the future. "Jacob," Samuel said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and curiosity, "I've heard so much about your cabin, and I wanted to ask you something. I'm building my own home, and I've been rushing to get it finished, but I'm not sure I'm doing it right. What advice would you give me?" Jacob looked at the young man, his face soft with a knowing smile. He had heard this question before, but it had a different weight now. The world was changing, and with it, the expectations of those who came to Lancaster seeking a better life. "Samuel," Jacob said, his voice calm and steady, "when I built my cabin, I didn't rush. I knew that when the storms came, and they always do, I would need something strong, something that could endure. It's not about building quickly, it's about building well. Take your time, build for what you can't see." Samuel nodded thoughtfully, understanding the weight of Jacob's words. He had come seeking a shortcut, a quick solution to the challenges of building a home. But Jacob was teaching him something far more valuable, that the answers weren't in speed, but in patience and preparation. As Samuel walked away, Jacob felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had spent his life building more than just a cabin. He had built a community, a legacy, and a way of life that would carry on long after he was gone. The land would continue to grow, the town would continue to thrive, and the lessons of patience and foresight would remain etched in the hearts of those who lived there. And so, as the seasons changed once more, Jacob Stoltzfus continued his work with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through the years. He knew that the future would bring challenges, but he also knew that the community he had helped build was ready to face them, not with haste, but with the slow, steady strength that had always been their greatest asset. As the years wore on, Lancaster began to see subtle changes. The young families that had settled in the valley grew in number, and with them came new ways of thinking. The world beyond Lancaster was shifting rapidly, pushing against the boundaries of the simple life that Jacob Stoltzfus had carefully built. Industrialization, new technology, and the whispers of the world beyond their valley began to seep in. But Jacob, now in his late 70s, remained rooted in the old ways. He still woke with the sun, tended his crops by hand, and spent long hours by the fire in the evening, reflecting on the wisdom he had gathered over a lifetime. He had never sought change, never chased after the fast-moving currents of progress that seemed to excite so many of the younger generation. Yet, as the seasons continued to change, Jacob felt an unsettling awareness that the town was changing too. It wasn't just the new settlers, it was the faster pace of life that had begun to take hold. Where once Lancaster had been a place where time moved with the seasons, now it seemed to be in a constant rush. People were working harder, trying to get ahead, pushing for progress at the cost of patience. The simple acts of building a house, farming, and living had become more mechanical, more focused on efficiency rather than longevity. Jacob's cabin, once a symbol of quiet endurance, stood as a reminder of the past. As he looked out over the town from his porch, he saw the contrast clearly. Homes were now being thrown up in a matter of days, with little more than quick tools and hastily made decisions. The delicate care and thoughtfulness that had once marked every home, every barn, every structure in the town had begun to fade. It was as though the storms of modern life were sweeping through Lancaster, and the people, eager to catch up, were forgetting the most important lessons. One evening, as Jacob sat by his hearth, he heard a knock at the door. It was Samuel, the young man who had come to him for advice years ago. He had now finished his own home, a sturdy structure, but one that lacked the thoughtfulness Jacob had urged him to consider. The roof was slatted, but not in the careful, deliberate way Jacob had built his own. The walls were solid, but there was a hurriedness to the design that Jacob could feel in his bones. "I've finished the cabin, Jacob," Samuel said, his voice tinged with unease. "But there's something that doesn't sit right. I built it fast, just like everyone said I should. It's strong, it's solid, but—" He paused, his eyes searching for the right words. "It doesn't feel like home." Jacob smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "You rushed it, Samuel. You built it to withstand the storms you've seen, but you must remember, sometimes the worst storms are the ones you can't see. When you build with care, with patience, you build not just for survival, but for peace. It's the peace that makes a house feel like home." Samuel sat down beside Jacob, the weight of the words settling in. Jacob had spent his life teaching not just how to build, but why. The pointless roof slats, the careful choice of logs, the slow, deliberate effort. They weren't about avoiding the storm, but about learning to live with it. The real storms weren't the ones that arrived with the first snow. They were the ones that no one saw coming, the storms of time, of change, of loss. The conversation between Jacob and Samuel that night lasted well into the early morning hours, and though they spoke of many things, the truth Jacob shared was simple. You must build for the worst, but you must also build for the peace that comes after the storm. In the years that followed, the town of Lancaster continued to grow. The winds of progress and change were relentless. And though Jacob Stoltzfus had once stood as a silent guardian of the old ways, he began to feel the weight of time in a different way. His body had grown slower, his hands stiffer, but his mind remained sharp, and his spirit remained steadfast. Jacob's farm, once the very heart of his life, had begun to show signs of age. The fields that had once yielded strong, healthy crops now bore fewer fruits, the animals were older, and the labor that Jacob had once managed with ease had become harder to keep up with. But even as he faced the inevitability of time, Jacob never once complained. One summer afternoon, Jacob walked the fields for the last time, taking in the land that had sustained him for so long. The smell of fresh earth, the feel of the soil between his fingers, the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, all of it was as familiar as his own breath. And as he paused in the middle of the field, looking toward the horizon, Jacob knew that it was time to pass on what he had built, what he had learned, to the next generation. He could see Samuel now, working alongside his own children, passing down the lessons that Jacob had given him. The town had come a long way, but the roots of Lancaster, the slow, thoughtful ways that had once defined it, still remained, tucked into every log, every beam, every thoughtful decision made with care. As Jacob sat on his porch one evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land, he thought about the years that had passed, the storms that had tested him, the wisdom he had learned from the quiet moments, and the people who had gathered around him, all of them carrying forward the lessons of simplicity and endurance. He had given them the tools to build, not just homes, but lives that would stand through any storm, no matter how fierce. Jacob Stoltzfus passed away quietly one night, the same way he had lived, without fanfare, without haste. He left behind a legacy not in the things he built, but in the way he had lived, quietly preparing for what was to come and teaching others to do the same. And as his neighbors gathered to remember him, they knew that the lessons of the slats, the walls, and the roof would live on. Lancaster had become more than just a town. It had become a place of quiet strength, a place where the storms could come and the homes would stand strong and warm against whatever the future might bring.